fericită și onorată să îl am ca oaspete astăzi pe profesorul Thomas Cusino, profesor emerit la Washington College, Maryland, United States of America. El este prezent online, dar o să spun totuși câteva cuvinte despre el înainte să invit pe dânsul să ia cuvântul. Este specialist în literatură modernă, nu doar americană, ci și europeană. A fost profesor de engleză la Paris, la Universitatea Sorbona. A fost cercetător Fulbright la Universitatea București și la Universitatea Lucian Blaga din Sibiu. Așadar, vedeți, este foarte apropiat de cultura română, chiar înțelege românește și astăzi ne propune o temă apropiată de cultura tradițională românească despre balada meșterului Manole ca legendă încastrată în literatura mondială. Și va vorbi în plus și despre noua sa carte pe care o am în mână și pe care o lasă circule, The Sense of Reading. Deci, o lasă circule, iar după conferință o voi duce la bibliotecă și va fi la dispoziția voastră spre a fi consultată. Bun. Mai trebuie să spun că profesorul Cusino nu este pentru prima dată în România. În 2014, el a fost prezent în persoană aici la Universitatea Babes-Bolyai, la Facultatea de Litere, a ținut o prelegere despre Samuel Beckett. Acestea fiind zise, îl invit la cuvânt. Profesor Cusino.
Hello, okay, my turn? Okay, thank you. Good morning from Chestertown, where it's 10 o'clock in the morning. And just to begin with a few remarks, the special pleasure that it is for me to be back, even if only virtually, in Cluj-Napoca at Babes-Bolyai University, where I made my first visit in the fall of 2014, so 9.5 years ago. In which I gave a talk on Samuel Beckett's Anatana Godot, which became a chapter in the book which I'm going to be talking about today. So there's a kind of, I've been to your university. I think this must be about the 4th or 5th visit, and always a special pleasure. So thank you for being here. To begin with a couple of expressions of gratitude, then of thanks, first of all to Professor Sava for having the idea of inviting me to talk to your group, to Ion Pop for two reasons, then for having designed, you've seen it all, this really beautiful poster that he made for the event, and also for having held my hand, as it were, and helped me with the making the connection between where I am in Chestertown, Maryland, and where you are in Cluj-Napoca, and to have made it as painlessly and seamlessly as he did. As I mentioned to him last May, I was in Sibiu, and there was a real crisis the last moment just before I was supposed to go on in Lisbon, in Portugal. And thanks to Ion Pop, then that crisis has been averted. The subtitle of my book, as you noticed, then it's the Seance of Reading: Uncanny Designs in Modernist Writing, and it occurred to me just this morning as I was having my first cup of coffee that there's a kind of a couple of uncanny coincidences, as it were. In my giving a talk today on the Manole legend in, of all places, the Sala Lucian Blaga at Babes-Bolyai University. Lucian Blaga, of course, having written a play, Mestrul Manole, or Manole, I guess you say, which creates an interesting coincidence. The coincidence that you wouldn't be aware of is that an American professor with the name Cousineau is giving you a talk on the Manole legend. The reason for that coincidence is that the Cousineaus of North America, of which there are thousands and thousands, are all descendants of a single progenitor. His name was Jean-Baptiste Cousineau, and he was a stonemason. He was a builder, like Manole. He emigrated at the end of the 17th century. He emigrated from Périgord in France to Montreal. And it was in Montreal more than 300 years ago that he built houses, stone houses, and stone houses whose walls did not collapse, that they're still there after hundreds and hundreds of years. The other uncanny coincidence in a way is that the name Cousineau is virtually buried in France. You can find it on gravestones in France. You'll find very few living Cousineaus in France. In contrast to that, there are thousands and thousands of us, as I said, in North America. And as far as my having written a book on the Manole legend, it reminds me that I am the descendant of a very long line of manual laborers. My father was a carpenter, and it's in any event, there was a lineage of manual laborers whose skill abandoned me. I don't have it in the least, and so have become a writer instead of, and have built, as it were, literary, I won't say literary monuments, books of literary criticism, which I've constructed as well as I possibly can. Okay, on to the talk itself then. This is the formal part of my presentation, which is now beginning. The title is, with my pronunciation of Romanian then, Legend of Master Manole, a Romanian ballad immured in world literature. I hope you'll appreciate the clever play on words in the ambiguity of the word immured in the title, because obviously Anna, Manole's wife, is immured in the walls of the monastery of Cluj-Napoca. And the suggestion that I'm making then is that the Manole legend is a kind of box within a box, or an immuring within an immuring, that it's there in Western literature, throughout Western literature, but in a very covert way. It's hidden within the walls, within the covers, let's say, of these various monuments of Western literature. The other aspect of the title, then, when I say it's a Romanian ballad immured in world literature, but I have in mind, some of you may know this book then, Romanian Literature as a World Literature, which was edited, among others, by Andrei Terian from Sibiu, who I met in New York a few years ago, and subsequently in Sibiu, and then a couple of others, Christian Mararu and Mircea Martin, whom I don't know. The reason for I imagine that some of you will know the book. My reason for mentioning it is several years ago, Andrei Terian and Christian Mararu gave a presentation at the Romanian Cultural Institute in Manhattan, right in the middle of one of the most brutal winter evenings in Manhattan, which I attended. I walked 10 blocks in the freezing cold to attend this presentation of their book. At the end of the presentation, I raised my hand and I said, "Do you have a chapter on the Manole legend?" And they looked at each other and they looked at me and they said, "Well, no, we never thought of having such a chapter, of thinking of the Manole legend then as sufficiently important." Anyway, so just to suggest once again that the Manole legend is immured not only in Western literature, but it's also immured within the pages of this book. And in a way, the purpose of the book that I've been working on and that I had in mind when I asked them this question The purpose of the book is to reveal to mettre en valeur, as they say in French, as we say in French, to give to suggest the prominence which rightly is owed to the Manole legend. I was reading something about the legend this morning, and I was very surprised. I saw a detail. The author mentioned that foreigners, tourists throughout the world go to Curte de Arges because they want to see the wall in which Manole's wife Anna is immured. And I was so surprised by that because I had never heard of the Manole legend until a couple of years ago. Someone mentioned it to me, and I asked my a Romanian friend, I said, have you ever heard of something called the Manole legend? And she burst out laughing, and she said, I memorized it. We were made to memorize it in school. So I find that very interesting, the idea that the legend itself is kind of buried or is within the borders of Romania. And I'm wanting, I hope not too presumptuously, in my book to give it a wider, to make it more widely known. I want to say one other thing. For many years, and this is a project that's been going on for a long time. The first talk that I gave was at Sala Pitamosh in Bucharest at the faculty there, and it was a talk on Hamlet and not Waiting for Godot, but the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, T.S. Eliot's poem, and the title of the talk was The Daedalus Legend, or the Daedalus Complex. I think I was calling it already the Daedalus Complex, and that was I won't go into the reasons for having chosen the Daedalus legend because it would be too distracting, but just to say that I wanted very much to hold on to it because it evoked the Oedipus complex. I like the interplay between the Oedipus complex and the Daedalus complex. But when I discovered the Manole legend, I realized that it was even more perfect. It was the most perfect expression of that underlying theme of the relationship between sacrifice and creativity that was going to be the focus of my book. Mircea Eliade and his book, Commentaire sur la légende de Maître Manole, was very, very important. It's really at the foundation, the starting point of my book. In the concluding chapter of that commentaire, the commentary, then it's been translated into Romanian, but not into English. In the conclusion, he argues that the Manole legend is the most perfect expression of all of those. There are all any number of legends having to do with the building of monasteries, of bridges, of walls, of whatever. And he argues then for the perfection of it. And it was indeed my own conviction that the Manole legend was more, as it were, more perfect than the Daedalus legend, that I adopted it for the introductory chapter of my book and for the thread, as it were, that runs throughout the entire book. So that's another idea that I have, and that may be of interest to you as Romanians, the idea that there is a legend, the Daedalus legend, which is known throughout the universe, as it were, and the Manole legend, somewhat less known, but perhaps of greater value in terms of the project that I have in mind. Maybe do you have this handout?
Yes, I do.
You do have it. Okay.
Yes.
Let me just say briefly, if you'll take it for a moment. As I said, it was in 2015, so 8 years ago, that I first learned of the Manole legend. You were 8 years old when you learned of it. I was 70 years old 8 years ago when I learned of it. for quite a long time, for decades, and again, I've really done nothing on Mircea Eliade. But I was in Cluj 10 years ago. Someone mentioned Eliade, and I drew a blank. I had been working on the French cultural critic René Girard, who's done a lot of work on scapegoating, and the first of these books, then, my book Ritual Unbound, which was published about 20 years ago, that's all inspired by René Girard. And so when I discovered the Manole legend, and
wait a second, could you maybe repeat the last?
Like what?
Can you maybe repeat the last 1 minute of the presentation, because the connection is a bit tricky?
Oh, okay, sure. Is it being recorded?
Yes.
It is. Good. Okay. So, right. So let's go back. If I can only remember, what it reminds me of. Do you know that the Marx Brothers film where one of them is playing the piano and he forgets how it goes? And he says, "Don't worry, it'll come back. It'll come back." So, what was I talking about? I was talking about the many, many years that I had been teaching and writing and publishing a book called Ritual Unbound, Reading Sacrifice in Modernist Writing, which was based on the work of the French cultural critic, though he lived in the United States and taught there, named René Girard, there are many books on scapegoating rituals. The most famous, I suppose, being Violence and the Sacred. May have, but there are others on this called The Scapegoat and so on. And so when I discovered the Manole legend, and not only the Manole legend, but even more importantly than that, Mircea Eliade's commentary on it, I'll explain why that was important in a moment. I saw immediately the transition between what was very, very familiar to me, scapegoating rituals, and the archaic construction rituals that Mircea Eliade talks about in his commentary on the Manole legend. Again, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I'll have more to say about that. But just it made for a very, very nice transition for me. And again, all the let me say something. If you have the handout at hand, you would look at it and notice with the first book, do you all see? Those of you who have it, the first book called Ritual Unbound, the introduction I've called the Oedipus complex. That's kind of with hindsight. I didn't actually do that in the book itself, but with hindsight, I'm calling it the Oedipus complex. And notice that it's not the Oedipus legend. Oedipus is in italics. So I mean the play, Sophocles' play, Oedipus. And the distinction that I'm making is between Sigmund Freud, who, using the Oedipus legend, made with the focus on incest, with my reading of the play Oedipus focuses on, as with René Girard, focuses on the element of scapegoating. Are we okay? Okay? Okay. And just to remind you, and I don't want to go off on digressions, but to remind you or to explain to you why I associate the play Oedipus with scapegoating. Do you remember there's a plague which has descended upon the city of Thebes? Everyone's dying, women are not giving birth, crops won't grow, and so on. And it turns out that the reason for the plague, the responsibility for the plague, falls on the shoulders not of the community, but of an individual, and an individual who has to be punished. Let me pause for a moment and just say So all of you will know the Manole legend. Many of you will know Sophocles' play Oedipus. And let me mention right now what you may not have thought of. I don't know, maybe it's a commonplace, but the analogy between Sophocles' play Oedipus the King and the ballad, the Legend of Master Manole, in that in both cases you have a group that is suffering or is going to be punished. Remember the prince Radu Negru is going to kill Manole and all his men if those walls of the monastery keep collapsing. And in the dream that Manole has, he's told it's not all the men that have to be punished, but rather one person who's going to be punished and immured then in the walls. And in an analogous way, in Oedipus the king, Creon comes back and tells Oedipus the reason for the plague, that everyone's dying in Thebes, is the guilt of one person, and one person, then whoever it was who killed the king, who has to be punished, has to be exiled. And by the way, let me just pause for a moment. Am I speaking at a good speed? And with the other students, could you raise in the back row? Do you understand what I'm saying?
I think so.
Is it going well? I mean, ask them.
Yeah, I think they can hear you.
They can hear, and they can understand?
Definitely.
Are you sure? Okay.
They said so.
Okay. They're very sweet. Okay. Onward then, back to my prepared notes. Eliade makes 2 points about the are we okay? Yes?
Yes.
Oh, okay. No, I thought you were saying something. Okay, I'll continue. There are 2 points that Eliade makes in his commentary on the legend. The first, of course, is the relationship between sacrifice and construction. And he relates as part of that, he talks about, and again, something I had never heard of. I had never heard of the Manole legend. And also, I had never heard of archaic building rituals or construction rituals. And apparently this is something, throughout prehistory, I suppose, there are a number of rituals involving the idea that there had to be a blood sacrifice, that some living being had to be placed in a building in order for that building to live, in order for it to survive, and that there's an echo then of that very primitive, that archaic belief and practice and ritual in the Manole legend. Okay, the second point that he makes is that the ritual itself has been abandoned, which is not necessarily true. I gave a talk at an Indian university in India, Bankura University, and in preparation for that, I discovered, thanks to my wife, that not all that long ago, maybe a couple of centuries ago, there was actually a building, a castle or whatever, built in India in which a person, a human being, was indeed sacrificed. But anyway, putting that aside, what was really, for me, the eureka moment in reading Eliade's commentary is that he said that the ritual itself, or the practice, has been abandoned, that we no longer bury living people in buildings, but there are vestiges or echoes, let's say, there are echoes of that primitive practice that return in literary works. And I thought, well, I'll tell you what I thought in a moment. The example that that Eliade gives in his commentary is Euripides' play Iphigenia in Aulis, Aulis. Maybe you know the story from the Trojan War. Well, I mean, I knew it from the Oresteia, from Aeschylus's play, the Oresteia, in which Agamemnon is told he has to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia in order that the winds will come, the gods will send the winds that will send the Greek ships to Troy and allow the Greeks then ultimately to destroy Troy, to be the victorious in the Trojan War. My own development then of that, and that was a very key point in Eliade's development. I think it's about halfway through his book, that in my own development of the ideas that then were inspired by Eliade and became the foundation of my book, I shifted from, say, the extrinsic benefit. Is that your daughter from the cafe? It's behind you. Yeah, hi, hello. In Eliade's interpretation, then the Trojan War itself is outside of the play, right? It's extrinsic. It happens after the sacrifice of Iphigenia. My own interest then was not in benefits to sacrifice or constructions that result from sacrifice that are outside of the work, but rather inside the work. Okay, if you follow me then, and I don't know to what extent these plays would be familiar to you, it was partly because of my reading these plays at Boston College back in the 1960s. I was going to be a physicist. I was a math and physics major, and that was my strong subject, to be sure. But I loved Greek tragedy so much that I wanted to be a teacher and to teach Oedipus and Antigone. So the play that I have in mind is Sophocles' play Antigone, that I would suggest to you as I think it provides a nice transition from Eliade's interpretation of the connection between sacrifice and construction, and my own interest in that connection applied to the work itself. That may seem rather vague. It's very simple. All I mean is that Antigone has to be sacrificed, and has to be sacrificed not only, if you know the play, not only because Creon is determined that he's going to show his power, but she has to be sacrificed. Sophocles is the author of the play Antigone. She has to be sacrificed in order that Sophocles writes a play that we're reading 2,500 years later. In other words, if Creon says, okay, Antigone, you're right, go bury your brother, no problem, or so on, no one's going to read the play. The construction of the play Antigone depends upon the sacrifice of Antigone, the immortality, if you will, the fact that the pages don't collapse of Antigone depends upon the sacrifice of Antigone herself. How am I doing for time, by the way? So I've done about a half hour. Do I have another half hour?
You have as much as you want.
Oh, hey, watch out! Be careful. Fig F. Well, I've been through about four of my. I have these index cards. I got about 4 of my index cards, and I've got about 12 more. So I'll try to move along a little more expeditiously. Okay, the point that I'm making about Antigone then, and about the internal benefit of the sacrifice, applies quite obviously, but at the same time, it's not something that's generally noticed. Let's say about, and I'll just take a very obvious example though, of literary works in which whose title is the same as the name of the protagonist, that has what we call an eponymous hero. So a play, Oedipus, Hamlet, The Great Gatsby, which I think I'll have a bit more to say. So I mean, it's quite clear that if in Oedipus, if the citizens of Thebes say, well, you didn't know that you didn't know he was the king, you didn't know that was your mother that you've been sleeping with and having kids with, so all is forgiven, whatever. The play doesn't survive. So also with Hamlet, if there's not a bloodbath at the end of Hamlet, the play, I shouldn't get into Hamlet. I think it'll be too complicated. But I will say one thing about Oedipus. Remember, in the play itself, if you know it, the reason that Oedipus, that this terrible fate has befallen Oedipus, it's the will of the gods. It is his fate, as it were, imposed on him by the gods, to which I say, nonsense. That's not true. The real reason that Oedipus suffers as he does, and the reason that the play goes on and on with Oedipus not recognizing that, oh my God, it must be I, the reason is that Sophocles wants to write, as he did with Antigone, he wants to write an immortal play. And he knows that, and I won't go into all the, if you invite me to Cluj sometime, and I'll go into all the details of do a very close reading of Oedipus with you. But do not believe, do not be fooled. Maybe I can give you a new word. Do not be, if you don't know it already, do not be hoodwinked by the idea that it's the gods who did this to Oedipus. It's not. It's Sophocles. And well, not to go on too long. Okay. Next step. I've talked then about. I mentioned René Girard. I mentioned scapegoating rituals. I've talked about the transition from scapegoating rituals under the inspiration of Eliade, the transition from scapegoating rituals to building rituals from one book, first book, to the second book. I want to talk a little bit about that phrase, the Manole complex, the Manole complex, which, among other things, to be sure, is an echo of Sigmund Freud's phrase, his coinage of the phrase, the Oedipus complex. And it's in the interpretation of dreams that Freud talks about, that he introduces this phrase, the Oedipus complex, which I imagine as a good number of you would be familiar with. If not, you're hearing it for the first time. The point that Freud makes, there are 2 points about, a couple of points about the Oedipus complex that he makes. First of all, that it's something that it refers to an infantile desire. It's the incest and parasite, or parasite first, and then incest. In other words, parasite killing your father, and incest sleeping with your mother, which are the 2 taboos, as it were, that Oedipus unconsciously, to be sure, and unwillingly violates. And Freud says that he, as he listens to the dreams of his patients, he realizes that there is this underlying pattern of parricide and incest, the desire to kill the father, sleep with the mother. And he says, oh, there's a Greek play that has a similar pattern in it. And so he names this pattern after Sophocles' play Oedipus the King, calling it the Oedipus complex. Okay, the next thing that Freud says, and this will establish again the connection, what Freud says is that the desire itself, or the desires of parricide and incest, have been repressed. And oftentimes patients laugh at him, or they resist. They say, oh, that's ridiculous. I would never think of killing my father, sleeping with my mother. What a foolish idea. So there's the resistance to this repressed idea, but Freud says it comes back in disguised ways, hidden ways, in the dreams of his patients. Okay, what I saw then, and what I found very exciting, and that again is at the foundation and the impulse behind my own book, is the idea that, noticing the parallel between Eliade's commentary and Freud's interpretation of dreams, in that Eliade says that this primitive practice of building rituals, that practice has been abandoned, but that it returns in disguised forms, not in dreams, but as I said before, in literary works. So that, and I won't go on too long because I do talk about that in the book, in the introductory chapter, which is called the Manole complex, Manole complex, I keep hesitating. I talk about that transition from Freud to Eliade, which is very, very much at the basis, at the foundation. We wanting to return to that idea of the foundation, of the stone foundation, as it were, the intellectual or the conceptual foundation of the book. Oh, I want to get on. I'll be getting on to Gatsby, I think, in a few moments. But just to say that part of my, and if you have this handout again with the three, so they refer to the three books that I've written. The Ritual Unbound was published, I said that, I think, 2004 by the University of Delaware Press. The Seance of Reading was published last week in Bucharest by Editora Universitară. God willing that I live long enough to Double Business Bound will be published. Oh, who knows? It will, inshallah, as the Muslims say. Maybe one of these days. But the idea, a term that often comes to mind and may be familiar to you from your classes in literary theory, is the term defamiliarization, to defamiliarize a work. It's a term that's famously associated with the Russian formalist critics, and that, in other words, that the kind of the common goal, the common impulse behind all three of these books is the impulse to defamiliarize, to take something which is, to take a literary work which is very familiar, and to look at it in a way, to look at it in a light that defamiliarizes it, that makes you feel that you're seeing it for the first time, which is my excuse. And I'll tell you, I mean, quite frankly, and I know there have been all of these developments and going this way and that way in literary theory and in the practice of teaching. And for the last almost 60 years, I've been teaching the books that I was taught at Boston College back in 1960. And there's a double excitement about it in a way, in that it was very exciting for me coming from a working class background where there was, I mean, literature was not the reading of literary mind. The building of buildings was very important to my father and his. There were 11 of them. My father and his, and it was a Canadian family after all, a French-Canadian family. So there were lots of them, 8 boys and 3 girls, and the men they were all builders in one way or another. Why did I get off on that? Anyway, I better. Oh yeah, to the idea then that we're defamiliarizing, or the going back to very familiar works, the Great Gatsby, Hamlet, Waiting for Godot, if it still is, Sophocles' Greek tragedy, Homer's The Iliad is very, very important to the 3rd book that I'm working on now, and that was a real thrill back in the 1960s, and a renewed thrill even now, some 60 years later, as I reread it very, very closely in preparation for what I'm doing now. But as far as the term, the Manole complex, for you Romanians, it creates, I hope, it creates an effect of defamiliarization, that you'll see the Manole legend is there, but presumably you've never heard of the Manole complex. So there's a moment there of uncanniness. And then the second area in which there's an effective defamiliarization and has nothing to do with being specifically Romanian is the defamiliarization of familiar literary works. As you'll see, if we just for a moment and to look at the second of the books, which is written under the inspiration of Mircea Eliade, for the most part, then, they're literary works that are quite familiar. The Great Gatsby, The Sisters is the first short story in James Joyce's collection, Dubliners. It seems, I mean, it's taught everywhere, I think. Rebuilding Lisbon in the Book of Disquiet. I don't know if you would recognize the Book of Disquiet, Le Livre de Langue, well, no, the French. It's Fernando Pessoa, the Portuguese writer, who, along with Emil Cioran and Thomas Bernhard, are my 3 favorite writers among, I can't say among the living, but among the 20th century, at least, writers. Doing it in Waiting for Godot, which I may say a few things if I don't run out of time, though I've been assured I can talk as long as I want. Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Endgame. Chapter 7, A Short History of Decay, that's the English translation. It seems a little peculiar, of Précis de Décomposition. It's Emil Cioran. And whatever the Romanian, the title of the Romanian he wrote it in French in the late 1940s, Précis de Décomposition. And that's one where I imagine that certainly any Romanian reader of my book will know right away who Emil Cioran is. But a lot of non-Romanian readers, a lot of American readers for sure, will have no idea who in God's name he is. And I'm very pleased. I mean, he's one of my heroes, one of my absolute favorites. The first time I read Précis de Décomposition, the book fell out of my hands. I laughed so hard just reading the first page of it. He's a wonderfully humorous writer. Being misfits and a good man is hard to find. That's a very famous story in America, at least, and in the English-speaking world. It's by a woman who adopted a man's name. Her name was Mary O'Connor. She called herself Flannery O'Connor, and this is her most famous story. And then Light in August. I don't know, would you recognize the author? It's William Faulkner, and one of Faulkner's very greatest and most familiar novels that I am reading in this seance in a very defamiliarizing way. Maybe I should say something about the title. Why not? the title of the book, The Seance of Reading, what I have in mind is that as you read the book, for you Romanians in particular, you're familiar with the Manole complex, and that you see the apparition, so that it's like a seance, like a kind of mystic meeting in which something from the past, the Manole legend and building rituals, resurfaces, as it were, in the course of the seance. But I also mean by the seance of reading, what becomes very unfamiliar and destabilizing in a way is the relationship that you see between the protagonist, or you see the protagonist as the victim. Let me say that. You see just as Oedipus is the victim of Sophocles in his play, so Gatsby is the victim of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald gets killed at the end. Why? Because he wants to write The Great Gatsby. And the Great Gatsby is not going to be a great novel, not going to be the great American novel if he lets Gatsby and Daisy ride off in the sunset, as it were. Okay, so that idea of so with the seance then, the idea of the uncanny way in which you see this back and forth movement between the protagonist and the work. Oh, and I know there's one. I want to tell you this. There's an American critic named Kenneth Burke, Burke, who's a great genius of literature, and he died a long time ago. But his work is surely immortal. And one of the inspirations for my work, even though I don't mention him, I forgot about him at some point, is he says that the goal of a writer is to create the perfect work. What the writer wants to do is to create the perfect work. Okay, not a big surprise, though not every writer, I suppose, but even desires, maybe wants to achieve popularity rather than perfection. But what he says is that in order to create the perfect work, the author has to find the perfect victim. The perfect victim. And, I had been teaching for decades without ever really stopping to think that, oh yeah, Hamlet, Oedipus, Gatsby, they're all Didi and Gogo in Waiting for Godot, they're all victims of their authors. And not only that word victim, but also that Burke applied the word perfect, both to the protagonist and to the work. And if you're listening, if you're following me, I'll make the further point that the author perfects. Let me put it this way: the sign of the perfection of the protagonist, the sign, the emblem of the protagonist as victim, is his failure. His failure. And the sign of the achievement of the author is his success. So that, in other words, and all of the titles of my chapters refer to this idea, whether it's fixing, doing, playing, or whatever, it's that word points to the ambiguously, it points both to the failure of the protagonist and to the success of the work. There was a stray thought just went through my mind, and if it comes back, I'll give it to you. Otherwise, I've forgotten it. Shall I pause for a moment? Does anyone, I'm going to talk now a bit about specific examples. And I have in mind The Great Gatsby and maybe I can ask also if Waiting for Godot is a good choice, if that play is known to you. Johan, could you, is it? Are students familiar with Waiting for Godot? How do you say it? Abstep Thomas Godot?
Așteptându-l pe Godot.
Așteptându. Thank you. I knew there'd be a Romanian here. Do students know the play? Could you ask them?
They know the reference.
They know the reference. Okay. They know they're supposed to know it. Okay. Are there any questions about, that's kind of the background. And I promise not to take too much longer in going to my examples, but it would be a good moment if there are any questions, which can be asked either in English or French, but don't even think of asking me a question in Romanian. I've taught myself to read Romanian, but I can understand every other word when it's spoken, but I cannot understand Romanian sentences. Shall I just continue then?
I think so.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to stand up and stretch my legs, and I'll be back in just a few seconds, okay? Oh. Okay, so am I back now? I am. I'm still here. Yeah. You have you shown the diptych?
Well, I was waiting for your signal.
Right. Yeah. I'm sorry. I should have given it to you. Yeah.
Should I?
Why don't you? Can you put it up and leave it up, or do you have to take it down?
I can leave it up.
Oh, okay. Leave it up. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Oh, it's so beautiful, isn't it? It's a very, very nice image of it too. Thank you. Yeah, I'll say more about it later on, but at least for now that the students see it. Okay, I'll talk now, making the transition then from the general remark that I made about the Manole legend and about the archaic building rituals that underlie it, and say a few things then in relation to that, to make a few remarks that I think may have the effect of defamiliarizing, let's say, of defamiliarizing the Great Gatsby. And maybe in preparation for that, and if you look back at the table of contents for the seance of reading, you'll see that the title, each word, each key word for the title of each of the 9 chapters is in the participial form, in the ing form of the verb. And they all refer, all of those words, fixing, scrupulous, rebuilding, doing it, and so on, they're all words that appear within the works themselves. And the point that I make in the book is that these little words that one otherwise would not notice actually is a kind of open sesame. It opens up to a quite marvelous interpretation of the work. And the example that I have in mind is, maybe you know Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Purloined Letter, the stolen letter, in which the letter is there in the letter that's disappeared, presumably. It's there in plain sight, but no one sees it until the very end. What's his name? Dupin, I think, the detective who finds it. And so I have this idea that in each of these works, The Great Gatsby, Waiting for Godot, Light in August, there are these little words that no one notices, that don't seem important to interpretation of the work, and yet in a quite intriguing way are very, very important indeed. To get back to the connection between sacrifice and The Great Gatsby, the key word in Gatsby, or the very curious word, a very uncanny word in The Great Gatsby, which I imagine you know the novel. It's at the end of chapter 8, when Nick Carraway discovers the bodies of Jay Gatsby, who's just been shot by George Wilson, and George Wilson, who's just killed himself. Fitzgerald says, or Nick Carraway says, the Holocaust was complete. The Holocaust, Holocaust. Now he's writing the novel in the 1920s. By Holocaust, he has nothing to do with Hitler, the Nazis, the final solution, or anything like that. It's rather the sacred, the religious ritual of punishing a scapegoat, of making an offering, let's say more specifically, of making a burnt offering to the gods, which it's very strange. It's a very strange choice of words, and yet it suggests the idea that that Fitzgerald is thinking of Gatsby's death as a kind of sacrificial offering. And I published an essay, it's online if you're ever interested. It's called The Great Gatsby, Romance or Holocaust. And the question is The Great Gatsby about the romance between Gatsby and Daisy? The answer to that is no, even though everyone thinks that it is. Fitzgerald himself said that he realized he did a very, very poor job of writing up the meeting, the reunion between Gatsby and Daisy. But what he does very, very well is to make us sympathize with Gatsby and to sympathize with the way Gatsby dies. Okay, listen, George Wilson shooting Gatsby in his pool is not a Holocaust. But what is a Holocaust in a way is in chapter 9. The novel, you would say the novel ends with chapter 8, Gatsby's death, but it doesn't, it goes on. And in chapter 9, Fitzgerald stages Gatsby's funeral. And who shows up to Gatsby's funeral? No one, or hardly anyone. Very, very few people are there. The hundreds and hundreds of people who come to Gatsby's parties in the early part, they're not there at all for his funeral. So the funeral itself becomes a kind of public sacrifice, a kind of public display of the contempt or of the indifference of people of the community, the indifference of the community to Gatsby. Okay, in the book then, in my book, The Seance of Reading, the chapter is called Fixing Things in The Great Gatsby. And it refers in the novel itself, there's a famous conversation between Nick Carraway and Gatsby, in which Gatsby says, I'm going to fix things so that they're exactly like what they were in the past. And Nick Carraway says to Gatsby, you can't repeat the past. And Gatsby says, well, of course I can repeat the past. And I want to say, because in the book, I use that fixing as the key word. I want to use repeating the past to suggest the way in which Fitzgerald's novel can be read as a disguised rewriting of the Manole legend, just so as unlike Lucien Blaga's play, which is very obviously, very transparently a rewriting. Here in Gatsby, we have a covert rewriting. What I mean by that is that Fitzgerald makes Gatsby the perfect victim. He makes him the perfect victim by making him fail in his effort to relive the past. And I think, again, if you know the novel, you understand what that's all about, that Gatsby goes back, he builds his house right across from where Daisy and Tom Buchanan live. He does all kinds of things in the effort to be reunited with Daisy, and it all fails. In the novel itself, though, so that if Gatsby fails at repeating the past and becomes the perfect victim by failing to repeat the past, then the counterpart to that in my reading, my defamiliarized reading of the novel, which is not really about Daisy and Gatsby, but is about Fitzgerald's own success in repeating the past. And what I mean by that, and maybe I should move a little more quickly on it, I'll just say, if you have read, if you reread the novel, you see there are 9 chapters. The 5th chapter stages the reunion between Daisy and Gatsby. And there are 4 chapters on either side of that chapter 5, chapters 1 through 4 and chapters 6 through 9. And if you read the novel closely, you'll see there are all kinds of things that happen in chapters 6 through 9 that repeat things that had happened in the first 4 chapters of the novel. So that just within the work itself, the novel, The Great Gatsby, repeats its own past. Outside of The Great Gatsby, in terms of the way in which Gatsby repeats the literary past, where Fitzgerald repeats the literary past and succeeds at it in parallel to Gatsby's failure to repeat his personal past. And among the ways in which Fitzgerald repeats the literary past, the poem, the novel is filled with allusions, filled with, I don't want to say borrowings, filled with the inspiration, let's say, of the poetry of John Keats, the English Romantic poet. Keats was the favorite of all, greatly admired, and Fitzgerald even said that he admired him in certain ways more than he admired William Shakespeare. So there are all of these borrowings, let's say, from Keats's poetry that you find in The Great Gatsby. The other borrowing is certainly the Legend of Daedalus, which I mentioned at the beginning, where Gatsby is a kind of Icarus character, as Manole is an Icarus. Manole makes these wings and he falls to his death in an Icarus-like way. While Fitzgerald is very much a Daedalus kind of character, and there are references. I won't look in detail at the novel, but there are references to the Daedalus legend in The Great Gatsby. The most obvious literary allusion is to Petronius, the Latin author. Petronius is the Satyricon. He has a character in it named Trimalchio, who throws big parties, basically. And in the novel, in The Great Gatsby, Nick Carraway says Gatsby's career as Trimalchio had come to an end. Trimalchio was one of the titles that Fitzgerald thought about for before he decided on The Great Gatsby. Trimalchio in West Egg, he was going to call it, and that would be a way of showing that he's rewriting, that he's read. He's an erudite author. He's read a lot of books, and he knows the literary past, and he can make use of it in a way. He can relive it. He can repeat it in a way in whose success mirrors Gatsby's failure. I'll only say 2 words about the next point because it's in the book, which you could read. I did hear the word biblioteca, something like that, in Professor Sava's introduction, so I know the book is in your library. That the most important way, and maybe most disguised, most hidden literary borrowing in The Great Gatsby is to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And I won't say any more about that, just to mention that it's a great classic of Anglophone literature. The Polish writer Joseph Conrad, for whom English was a 3rd language after French, and the novel, the long work, then the novella, Heart of Darkness, which he wrote, and which Fitzgerald, in very disguised ways, very hidden, underhanded ways, is borrowing from in his work. I won't develop it because I do in the book, but it reminds me, if you're interested, and you'd like to hear more of my views on The Great Gatsby, I did do a lecture, and maybe some of you have seen it. There was a video of it, and it's on YouTube. It's called, and it's on The Great Gatsby. So if you type in on YouTube, Cousineau Gatsby, it'll turn up. And it's called Plagiarism Unbound. And it's the idea that in that talk, before I had ever heard of the Manole legend, it's the idea that Gatsby fails because he plagiarizes. He tries to steal another man's wife, the most flagrant example of plagiarism, to make another man's wife his wife. And while Fitzgerald successfully plagiarizes, as it were, the literary tradition, the literary past, I should say. If I just continue with what I have, I would say a few things about Waiting for Godot. But if that's only a reference, if you're not all that familiar with it, I may skip over that and get on to and sort of wrap things up, move towards a conclusion. And what I'm thinking, if you are interested, though, in Beckett's play Waiting for Godot, Așteptându Godot. Beckett directed that play in German with German actors then in Berlin in 1975. Warten auf Godot. And actually, you know, it's relevant, I suppose, with your being up in Transylvania, in Cluj, where you have Hungarian and German and Romanian, also to be sure that there may be some of you who are studying German or who speak German. It may even be your first language. So it's Beckett's version, then, Warten auf Godot. My wife and I saw it in Paris when it came to Paris in the spring of 1976. And it's a quite amazing production of the play, which I recommend to you very highly. And what I just remembered, and I want to tell you, is it's available on YouTube. So along with my lecture on Gatsby, if you just type in Warten, W-A-R-T-E-N, Warten auf Godot, you'll see, and it's a brilliantly done production of the play. One other thing, if you're interested, I want to, I'll conclude by saying a few things about the book that I'm working on now, and about which I expect, or I hope, to be giving guest lectures over the next few years. Generally, when I write, or what I write is as with the book that I'm talking about today, or launching today. They're almost always based on guest lectures, so that in having the opportunity to talk with students, and also because I talk so much more easily and fluently than I write. Talking is a stimulus to that final act of writing. And so oh, I know, yeah. If you'd like, I'll say a few words about the idea of symmetry, the general concept as the foundation of the work that I'm doing now. But if you find it interesting, I'll tell you right now, I published an essay which appeared in a literary journal that's published in Sibiu, again, coincidentally, by Cluj-Napoca University, by professors in the English department at Cluj-Napoca University. And it's a journal called East-West Cultural Passages. East-West Cultural Passages. And in that, I published an essay. It was in the December 2021 issue. And it was one of the first things that I did, a first foray, as it were, a first effort in thinking about symmetry as a hidden design in a literary work. And it's an essay on Joseph Conrad, and specifically on Heart of Darkness and The Secret Sharer. And the title of the essay is Always Symmetrize. Always Symmetrize. For those of you who are professors, and maybe for some of you who are students, you recognize the title as an echo of a much more famous statement by the American Marxist literary critic Frederick Jameson, whose book The Political Unconscious begins, always historicize, which I've metamorphosed then into the into this abjuration, always symmetrize. And anyway, I won't say anything more about it, because if you're interested, you just go online, Google it, Cousineau, always symmetrize. It's online, so it'll pop up. Jon, if you could put up the Ezekias amphora. Oh, hi, you're still there. Okay, so this is to begin with an amphora whose title is, as Jon recognized immediately, much to my surprise when we talked the other day. He said, "Oh yeah, sure, I know that. That's Ezekias's urn." And it's the urn, an urn that represents an amphora, a vase, that represents Achilles and Ajax playing a board game or a dice game. There's a die there, and one is throwing a die in the back and forth. What you can't, I guess I'm not even sure in that image if you can see Achilles and Ajax are speaking words in the form of a line. It looks as though it may be it looks as though it may be a spear, but it's actually a word. And what Ajax is saying is 4, the number 4, patru. And while Ajax is saying 3, so that Achilles has thrown a 4 and Ajax has thrown a 3. The idea then that in this, let me maybe real quickly, what's fascinating about it, or maybe just to step back a moment, the reason that I found out, I had never heard of it, unlike you. I did know Homer's Iliad, and I knew Cedric Whitman is his name, like Walt Whitman, Whitman, Cedric Whitman, who wrote a book called Homer and the Heroic Tradition, which I read again back at Boston College in the 1960s. And in that book, he has a chapter, there are 2 chapters, in fact, on geometry. And one of them is called the Iliad and Geometric Design. And what he says is essentially that the design of the hidden design of the Iliad, the covert design of the Iliad, was inspired by vases, by funerary vases that could be seen in Athens. And so I was looking around for a vase, an amphora, an urn, and I came upon this one, whose aesthetic beauty was just immediately jumped out at me, was so apparent. And I look, in fact, I have it on the, I don't know if you see it on the wall of my office, both a close-up and a distant view. I find it endlessly fascinating. And what's so interesting about it is that it reveals the, I don't know if I could, well, I won't bother, but I have the schema of the Iliad on the wall of my office, but it may be a waste of time or of effort. That in Cedric Whitman's book, I discovered, thanks to this diagram, that the entirety of the Iliad is composed or is structured in the form of a chiasm, so that the last episode repeats the first, next to the last, second episode, next to the last, third episode, back and forth like that, until you come to the center. And what I realized is that in the Iliad itself, you don't notice this. You don't see this face to face, as it were, between the geometrically organized, symmetrically organized episodes. What you see is the literal face to face between the Greeks and the Trojans. You see the conflict at the center on the surface of the Iliad, and you don't see the invisible foundation or sub-basement, as it were, sub-foundation of the Iliad. And the uncanny thing then is that what Ezekiel has done is he's turned that upside down, so that it's like I just thought of the Centre Beaubourg in Paris, the museum, where what normally is hidden is outside, all those pipes and so on, and the escalator that you see at, the Musée Pompidou, the Centre Beaubourg, as it's called more familiarly in Paris. And that what Ezekiel has done is to turn the Iliad inside out, so that you see the perfect symmetry, the perfect harmony created by symmetry, and you see just a tiny bit of the conflict that's created by the symmetry of Ajax throwing the dice, and Ajax repeating that act. And so that they're involved in and you see, there's all this stuff. You see the armor that they're wearing, you see the spears and all of this. But what's fascinating, of course, I say of course, what you may notice is the way in which the kind of symmetry that's created between opposites, that all of these implements that are used for conflict, that are used for people killing each other, become part of the aesthetic design. So there's a symmetry between the collision between the opposing armies in the Iliad, between the opposing armies, as there's a collision between Achilles and Ajax, but there's also a collusion. So that interplay between collision, conflict, collusion, both of them produced by symmetry, that's the foundation of the project that I'm working on, and of which this will be the cover. Oh, by the way, it reminds me that what I wanted for the cover of my book was the diptych that you've seen. It's by a Moldovan artist named Igor Vieru, of the Legend of Master Manole. Yes, right there. And the rights to it, the man who, Vieru, died several years ago. The rights to his paintings passed on to, I think it was to a son, but the son also died. Is that it? Anyway, I found out from a young woman who had written in Romanian, which I can, again, more or less read. I saw in Adavarul or something like that. And I wrote to her, and she said, oh, well, the rights to the paintings, to the reproduction of the paintings, it's the National Museum in the capital of Moldova, which I always misremember because I get it mixed up with the Gradina Cizmaju in Bucharest. But anyway, I wrote a couple of times to the museum asking for permission to use the diptych, and they never wrote back. So I ended up with what I think is a very beautiful representation of the seance of reading, which on the cover of my book, that's an image from Samuel Beckett's late play, Ohio Impromptu. Yeah, I've gotten off a little bit from what I had in mind. But anyway, yeah, just the idea. And so if you go back to the table of contents for it's not yet a book, it's a projected book, you'll see that what I've done in the introduction, introducing the idea of the Ezekiel complex, I've matched the Iliad with Ezekiel's amphora. and in which you'll see then, I think from what I've said already, you'll see the way in which the symmetrical, but it's a symmetry that's partly a symmetry of inversion, that what is hidden in the Iliad, the geometrical design, comes to the surface and is made overt in Ezekiel's amphora. And then in each of the 9 chapters, again, 9 is a number that I'm holding on to and carrying over from my second book, is that in each of those chapters, I'm recreating that symmetry. I'm exploring the symmetry as I have already done with chapter 3, between Heart of Darkness and the Secret Sharer. And chapter 1 on Oedipus and Hamlet is kind of a very polemical way of beginning the book, using the Ezekiel's complex, because as literary scholars know, both Oedipus and Hamlet have been very, very heavily interpreted in relation to the Oedipus complex. So I'm attempting in a way to dislodge the Oedipus complex and to replace it with what I'm calling the Ezekiel's complex. Let me, oh, I know, all right, the last thing. I'll say, you all, if I, you know, if you'll see, well, maybe you won't see it, I'll just tell you. Say with, I've made little notes to myself in the margins of the tables of content that I passed out. I put these Roman numerals in, but also, I'll get back to them in a moment. I put the name René Girard, reminding myself that he was the inspiration for the first book. Then I put Mircea Eliade as the inspiration for the second book. And Cedric Whitman, then Cedric, C-E-D-R-I-C, Cedric Whitman, Homer and the Heroic Tradition, as the inspiration for the 3 books, 3 authors that were the inspiration for my work. And the last thing that I did is, and I wrote to myself up at the top here, so I have 3 different complexes, the Oedipus complex, the Manole complex, and the Ezekiel's complex. But I wrote up here, Manole complex, Roman numerals 1, 2, 3. So 1 for Ritual Unbound, 2 for the Seance of Reading, 3 for to Double Business Bound. And what I realized, and I'll conclude with this, you know, when I said at the beginning that I realized that the Manole legend was even more perfect than the Daedalus legend, it's because, of course, the sacrifice of, right, to get back to it, and again, there are many, many things I could say about it, but I won't. The building of the monastery at Curte de Arges, for which Manole is unjustly famous, since it was not he, it was, what is it, Basarab, that the sacrifice of Anna is absolutely foundational, is crucial to the construction of the monastery, unlike the Daedalus legend, in which the death of Icarus is not integral, is not necessary to the fabrication of the wings. So that's one of the reasons that, and that was the initial reason that I shifted over to the Manole legend rather than, and used it to replace the Daedalus legend. The other thing I realized, though, is that all three of the complexes, the Oedipus complex, the Manole, and the Ezekiel's complex, they're all contained in a very hidden way, for sure, and in a way of which, again, I know the legend is a foundational one for Romanians, and it's all in the association with spirituality and sacrifice and all of that. But it's also so profoundly foundational to, again, to world, to global literature. And so with the idea of sacrifice, my second book, that's very obvious, right? So I won't have to explain how sacrifice relates to the Manole legend. With respect to my third book, on the idea of the imperative, the symmetrical imperative of writing, you notice, and Eliade does talk about this, this diptych, and in ways that I hardly need to explain to you because it's just so obvious when you look at it and respond to its formal beauty, the perfection of the work, that how wonderfully Vieru, the artist, has suggested the symmetry between the fate, the upward movement here of Anna, the downward movement of Manole. And so that's I could even use this. I want to use Ezekiel because of the connection with the Iliad, but I could use this as if only I could get permission. Someone in Romania, maybe my publisher in Bucharest now, could get permission from the authorities at the Art Museum in Moldova to give them permission to reproduce this as the cover. The other thing, though, and I'll end with this, and actually I had mentioned it at the beginning, the other thing about the Manole legend in connection with what I call the Oedipus complex, Oedipus in italics, the play, is, and it's a detail, I had forgotten about it, but I realized in rereading that detail that the prince, Radu Negru, is going to kill everyone if the walls don't stop collapsing. And Manole then very conveniently has a dream, though it turns out not to be that convenient, a dream in which the punishment, the responsibility that should fall on the shoulders of the men who are building, and who are building rather incompetently, that responsibility shifts over to a single person. And so that pattern of scapegoating that I call the Oedipus complex could also be called the Manole complex, once again, because it's that pattern of shifting blame from a group to a single individual is already there in the Romanian Ballad, which is immured in world literature. And I'll end there. Hello.
All right.
I'm going to stand up once again, and I'll be back.
Can we start the Q&A session?
Sorry?
I was asking if we can start the Q&A session.
Oh, sure.
All right. Professor Laura Ilia?
Thank you so much, Professor Cousineau, for this interesting food for thought. Unfortunately, I will have to go because I will have to launch Hannah Arendt's book at 6 o'clock, but I will keep in mind the following things and we'll discuss them in Bucharest, or maybe you'll discuss them afterwards. This idea that's really very interesting, that, the repressed desire for rituals, is coming back in books. So the repressed desire for rituals in the ancient world or in the Manole's complex ritual is coming back in books, in contemporary books, and that's a very thoughtful, a very deep thought. And also I was thinking, or maybe you can talk about it. I can stay 5 more minutes and then I have to go because otherwise I will be late. But I'm very curious to find out more about that connection between, so how do you make the connection? I'm sure you prove it in your book, but I'm curious to find out more the real connection between The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad and The Great Gatsby. Because they seem, I mean, they seem to come from completely different backgrounds. So how do you make the connection between the two?
Okay, right, because in the third book, it's The Heart of Darkness and Secret Shera. It's there in the book and also in the lectures, which on Plagiarism Unbound, which is on YouTube, which I didn't mention it. The most obvious way is most obvious connection is between in the pairing between Nick Carraway and Gatsby and Marlowe and Kurtz. So you have the active and one the narrator being a kind of alter ego to the main character, so that Marlowe is very, very close to Kurtz and yet very different from him as well. And at the same in a similar way, it's a kind of commonplace of discussion of The Great Gatsby that Fitzgerald was very influenced in that alter ego relationship between protagonist and narrator. Beyond that, you have remember that Fitzgerald says at one point, I think the students are leaving, are they going off to class or going up, I was going to say going off to lunch, no more going off to dinner or late afternoon activity, perhaps.
They actually have a class to attend to right now. So
right, that's what I thought. Sure. So goodbye.
Some of them, not all of them, though.
That Fitzgerald says at the end of The Great Gatsby in chapter 9 that he realizes that the novel, the story is about Midwesterners who were unadapted to life on the East Coast. And so that idea of, and I gave a talk in Constanza a couple of years ago. It was the, that American Studies 2014. And that the topic for the conference was migration. I thought, oh my God, I can't, but I wanted to talk about it because Ovid, of course, spent his final years in Constanza, what it's called, I forget the name now. But then I realized that, Fitzgerald says, he uses the word transmigration at the very beginning of the novel, and then he suggests at the end that it's been a novel about a movement of displacement, let's say, of people who are not where they belong. And that's true in Heart of Darkness also, where you have the Europeans who have come to the Congo. And you also, what I found interesting too, is that you have the relationship between Kurtz, who's very, very much part, and Marlowe also, who's very much part of the colonial incursion into Africa. And maybe you may know Chinua Achebe's essay on Heart of Darkness, in which he accuses Conrad through Marlowe of being a racist. That the idea that Marlowe is very, very much a European, as much as he distances himself from others. So Nick Carraway is very, very much a part of that upper class American. He's born into the upper class. That novel, but I may not be directly answering your question, and there are other points about, and they're not entirely coming back to me, so I'm hesitating for a moment. But the other thing that I find about, if I'm not digressing too much, and sometimes the digressions are interesting, it's The Great Gatsby is very rarely read as an ethnic novel, but it is. Fitzgerald was Irish American. I'm Irish American, in spite of the name Cousineau. My mother's family is from Ireland, and they came during the Great Famine. But Fitzgerald disguises himself as Nick Carraway in the novel, and that moves a little bit away from Heart of Darkness. But my other great example of a writer who hides his identity is Jack Kerouac. There's very few people know that English was Kerouac's second language, as it was my father's second language. Québécois, Joual, was my father's first language. As also, if you listen to Kerouac, have you ever done that? Listen to Kerouac on YouTube speaking French.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
It's a trip.
I excuse myself because I have to go now. And thank you so much for the presentation. We have the occasion to talk a little bit more in Bucharest in 2 weeks.
We'll see you in Bucharest. Yeah, look, and my wife's looking forward to seeing you again too.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Lara. Hello.
All right. Any more questions from our online guests? If not, I have a question I was supposed to ask you. I was wondering if you are familiar with Ion Talos's study, Meșterul Manole, which is after Eliade's work, our most important study concerning the ballad, which from that study, it is no longer a purely Romanian ballad, let's call it that way. And I think since you taught yourself to read Romanian, you should read that study.
Yeah. No, I'd like to very much, and I'm sure, and you pronounced his name in a Romanian way.
T-A-L-O-Sh, so S with a thingy.
A little love, Sidney. Yeah. Listen, just send it to me on message it to me on
Definitely.
Facebook, and I'll load it. No, I'd like very much to see it. No, the only other thing I know, I was in touch with a woman, a Romanian woman, when I was in Bucharest a few years ago, just an exchange of emails in which I know she was very critical of Eliade and that he ignored the Christian aspect of the legend and so on. But I never, not to go into details, but the communication did not develop very well. But so I'd be very curious to have a look at this book, and with the help of Google Translate, for sure.
It's a great study.
Yeah. Thank you. And
Any
listen,
more
just
questions?
tell
Well,
I was going to say, if I see
Yeah.
is this a new group of students who have come in?
No.
No,
No, they're the same.
some students left.
Had to leave and some are staying. Yeah, just tell them then, or they can hear me say it, that they can always, if they'd like to have any kind of follow-up. I know it's rather hard given this particular venue, to and whether in English, French, or Romanian, to send me questions or any kind of comments that they have. They can do it certainly on email, but they can also send me a friend request. And as a matter of principle, whenever on Facebook, whenever I see a friend request with a Romanian name, look. Sorry, I didn't hear. Are you asking me to stop?
No.
We have a little problem with the sound, so be patient a little.
Oh, okay.
să vină cineva, nu știu, s-ar putea să fie pus aici pe la 6. Deci, uitați-vă la ceas și că totul
I'm hearing you now.
Uite, Iosefina a ridicat mâna. Da.
Da.
Iosefina, ai ridicat
Bună
mâna.
seara,
Cred că și
România.
vorbește Iosefina, dar nu știu ce spune.
Noi vă auzim. Noi vă auzim. We can hear you. We just
Right,
wait.
and I hear you fine then. Yeah. No,
Yeah,
all I was
in the hall they do not hear me.
right. But do the students hear me now?
Yes.
They do.
Okay.
Okay.
Bună seara în România, bună dimineața din Arizona. Good morning from Arizona. I am Romanian lecturer at ASU in Arizona, and I just wanted to thank you for a very, very interesting lecture that you had for us. And I might say that I am really astonished because I never thought that I could mix or I could see the Legend of Manole, the archaic monastery legend, actually, the myth of creation, turned and approached in Fitzgerald's work. So this is very new to me. And I might say that one of my students from Romanian studies here, the lady also watched your lecture. So we will have in 1 hour and a half our Romanian class, and we will actually discuss Meșterul Manole. And it will be very nice to have this new approach that you shared with us. So I do thank you for this wonderful opportunity to hear new approaches in critics regarding this creation of art legend that we also have, but it's not also in Romania. It's among all the other
Yes.
territories in the southeast of Europe. So I do thank you for that.
Right. Well, listen, I would thank you very much. So you're teaching at the University of Arizona, or?
Yes, I'm teaching at the University of Arizona.
Which is that in Tempe or in Phoenix?
In Tempe. Right now we are in Tempe.
It's in Tempe, right? Well, listen, I mean, in Tempe, somehow the word temperature comes to mind. I'm on the East Coast, where it's very cold in the winter. It was 30 degrees when I was taking my morning walk so right away, I would thank you very warmly if you invite me to. And you don't have to. I just, for the pleasure. I enjoy talking, and I would certainly enjoy. I would certainly enjoy. February would be an ideal month to invite me to come to Arizona. I don't think that we've met, have we? I gave a talk in Salt Lake City at the Rocky Mountain.
No. I just got actually to Arizona, and I'm new. I'm teaching at Arizona only since this university, since September 2022.
There was the talk that it was on Emil Choran and Samuel Beckett.
But we have 10 more minutes.
Okay, yes.
We can
talk. I will add you on Facebook, and we will extend our talk. So let's the students, maybe they have other questions, or the people from online.
Okay. And
thank you.
Hi. Hi.
Hello. I have a question.
I'm not hearing very well. Sorry.
Now? Better?
Now I do, yes.
Okay, so you made this parallel between how Eliade and Freud both talked about somewhat a repression and a resurfacing of the ritual in literature, right? Can you think of other rituals that have the same pattern of resurfacing in literature or in art?
Well,
Besides.
What I was suggesting is that with the three books, it's a kind of a trilogy of books, which I did not plan it as a trilogy, but as I was writing this book on the Manole legend, I saw that there are three works that come together, so say with Freud, it's this one pattern, which is of parasite and incest, while what I realized, and which is a threefold, it's the mother, the father, the son, so it's a triangular pattern. And what I realized is that there's a kind of triangle of complexes of scapegoating, building ritual, and the symmetrical imperative, as I call it, in my third, and that they all relate. Then they, as I said, they can all be related, so that oh, I know. And what I wanted to point out and did not mention is the way in which, say, all three of those patterns involve. And I just saw this phrase a week or two ago. I was reading a book on the Oedipus legend, and the author used the phrase dynamics of transfer, dynamics of transfer. And what I realized is that these three different complexes, Oedipus, the play, Manole, and Ezekias, all involve a transfer. So that with Oedipus, so that's the fundamental, the underlying, the unifying connection among the three. And what I mean by that is that in the first, with scapegoating, you have a transfer, and in the Manole legend, a transfer of responsibility from a group to a single individual. And in Manole, of course, it's his wife. So it's someone who's very unlike the men who are building the monastery. And then in the building ritual, construction ritual, you have a transfer from the life of this living person. The life is transferred from the person to the building. Remember, Eliade says that Anna doesn't simply live within the monastery, she's incarnated into the monastery, and she animates the monastery. So you transfer from a living thing to an inanimate thing. And then what's interesting, I realized just the other day, is that with symmetry, it's a reciprocal transfer. It goes back and forth, left and right. Cedric Whitman points out in his book that the left hand, the right hand, is one of the fundamental patterns that one finds in the Iliad, and in I suppose in Greek literature as a whole. The wonderful phrase that recurs in the Iliad, the tide turns. There's a chapter that's called The Tide Turns, and the tide back and forth, back and forth. But what it means is that the Greeks are winning. And if the Greeks are winning, the Trojans are winning. Oh, I know. What slipped my mind before, the thought that went through, my favorite, probably one of the greatest of all 20th century writers, one of the greatest writers of any literary period, is a French woman, since you're all women, it reminds me, a French woman named Simone Weil. Is her name familiar? W-E-I-L, Weil. So it's a Jewish German name, but she was Parisian. There are many, she's an utterly brilliant woman who died very young. I think she was 40 years old when she died at the beginning of the Second World War. But if you don't know her, you might look her up. She's quite fast. In French, one of her greatest works is called La Pesanteur et la Grâce. It's translated as Gravity and Grace in English. But why I'm reminded of her, probably the most brilliant book ever written, it's a lengthy essay, not a book so much, on the Iliad, was written by Simone Weil. It's called L'Iliade, le poème de la force. So the Iliad, or the poem of force. And it's not very long, it's like 30 or 40 pages, but it's just, she was just one of the most stimulating, one of the profoundest thinkers that I've ever encountered. So Go and read her.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much, Professor Cousineau.
Again,
Thank you very much.
thank you. Mulțumesc foarte mult.
Mulțumim frumos. We have to stop the meeting because the room will have other students from 6 o'clock.
But Nora, just one last thing. What I said before when you lost the sound was that the students can always connect with me on Facebook. And whenever I see, my principle is that whenever I see a friend request from someone with a Romanian name, I accept it immediately.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For everything, for this wonderful evening. Thank you for the conference.
Thank you very much.
Okay, la revedere.
La revedere.
La revedere.
Mulțumesc, la revedere, o seară frumoasă.
In Arizona, don't forget.